Okay, so we're going to get started here. Let me get the captions on. Okay, so we're going to talk about the civil rights movement. So here, come on. Up here we go. So we're going to talk about the civil rights movement, and we're talking about the time period from 1954, roughly, which is the Brown versus Board of Education. This is a Supreme Court case. It was based on a lawsuit from the NAACP, where the Supreme Court ordered kind of school desegregation. Now, there can be different choices here for this. I chose this because it does result from an action of African Americans, and I wanted to make sure that I wasn't putting the beginning of the civil rights movement with what white people are doing. Although the Supreme Court was white people at the time, but it's important to note this was from a lawsuit from the NAACP pursuing their strategy of using legal means to end segregation. So some important context here is Black migration. This is part of the Great Migration, right, of African Americans moving from the South to northern cities. So there are about 3 million African Americans that had moved from the South to the northern cities. And at the same time, you have the white flight to the suburbs. So that means the cities became poor because many of these African Americans that came from the South, they were poor, right? They didn't have a lot of money because they were sharecroppers in the South. And so they were living in poverty in the cities. And that combined with a lack of opportunity, partly due to racism and also partly due to the less availability of unskilled factory jobs, which had been prevalent before World War II. Those were kind of going away a little bit. So the cities were becoming poorer. All right, so Brown versus Board of Education, I mentioned a bit earlier. This overturned the idea of separate but equal from Plessy versus Ferguson. It was a unanimous decision. That means it was 9-0. So it showed unity in the court, right? So there was no question like, oh, it was a close decision, so maybe we can, anti desegregation people could be like, maybe we can find a way around this. But no, there was no question about it, right? And that the Supreme Court said that schools should be desegregated, quote, with all deliberate speed, right? This is an important quote here because deliberate speed, those are kind of contradictory. So how fast should it go? This becomes a question. All right, Thurgood Marshall was the NAACP lawyer who argued the case before the Supreme Court, and he later became the first Black Supreme Court justice. He was appointed in 1967, 13 years after Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, another event of the 1950s, or there's a couple more here. In 1955, there's the Montgomery Bus Boycott. This is pretty famous. This is where Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. This was actually a planned protest. It was not a spur of the moment kind of thing. And this Montgomery Bus Boycott was organized by these Black community organizers, especially women. They're the ones that organized the boycott. This is also where Martin Luther King Jr. rose to prominence as a civil rights leader. And the tactics of the bus boycott and other civil rights protests were focused around peaceful protest and maintaining the moral high ground, like make the other side look brutal and violent, whereas the Black protesters would be peaceful, remain peaceful, and it would look much better in terms of like how the nation would perceive it. So a couple years after that, we have the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas. This is Little Rock High School in Arkansas. The Arkansas governor refused to integrate schools. His name was Orville Faubus. And this was like a challenge to federal power because the Supreme Court had said you have to desegregate, and the state of Arkansas was saying no. And so this is a challenge to federal power. So Eisenhower felt he had to step in. He was pretty reluctant to do so. He did not want to get involved in civil rights issues. So he had to send in the National Guard troops to escort these 9 high school students to integrate the Little Rock High School. So this is, again, Eisenhower doesn't have the best record of civil rights, but this is something he definitely did, even though it was more about the challenge to federal power than it was about the rights of African Americans and equality. Okay. We also have in, this contradictory characteristics, this idea of massive resistance. So after Brown versus Board of Education, school districts really around the country, but especially in the South, they tried to ignore the Brown decision, and local officials, they tried all of these different ways to get around the Brown decision by, by putting students based on their, quote, scholastic ability, of course, ended up with segregation anyway, or parents would pull their students out of public schools, and you have these private Christian schools that developed in the South and were essentially segregated schools. You have people like George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, saying things like segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, right? Really emphasizing their desire to maintain a segregated society. All right, so now outside of schools, we have this moving into kind of social areas too. In 1960 in North Carolina, we have the Woolworths lunch counter sit-ins. And these were Black college students. John Lewis was a part of this. He was a congressman. He wrote the book March. He was definitely a civil rights activist. And this is focusing on integrating public spaces. So these students would sit at the lunch counter and they'd refuse to move. They weren't allowed to be served there, but they stayed there anyway. And this kind of and by the way, you can go to the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. and see one of the Woolworths lunch counters in the Smithsonian that's preserved there. So this resulted in the civil rights group called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Again, this is college students here. Okay, they're trying to integrate public spaces. We also have in 1961 the Freedom Rides. So this is another public space. These are buses, like Greyhound type buses that move from state to state. And there was a planned protest here of interracial students, white and black, kind of sitting next to each other on the buses to defy rules on segregation. And there were all kinds of violence. In fact, John Lewis was beaten up and others were beaten up as part of the Freedom Rides. And this is organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. And the dangers, you actually had buses being blown up and that sort of thing. The president, John F. Kennedy, he actually sent federal marshals to protect the riders. So Kennedy was showing a little bit of support for the civil rights movement here too. Okay. We also have in 1963, the famous March on Washington. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. gives the iconic I Have a Dream speech. And there were about 200,000 people there. So we see this building up of support for civil rights and very high profile events. In 1964, we have Freedom Summer, where white Northerners are registering Black voters in Mississippi. Coming from the north down into the South to register voters in places like Mississippi was a big deal. So after Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon Johnson became president, and he helped to organize passage of two really important laws: the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act gave federal protection of voting rights to people, so you couldn't have, it outlawed all the ways that Southern states in particular tried to deny the right to vote to African Americans. And so what we end up seeing is we see this like difference between de jure segregation and de facto segregation. De jure means by law. So by the time the Civil Rights Act and Brown versus Board of Education, these are all getting rid of the laws that permit segregation. De facto means it's more about people's attitudes and like what the actual practice is. So you have a lot of resistance of law enforcement officials like Sheriff Bull Connor, who are using violent and brutal police tactics, dogs, tear gas, fire hoses, all that kind of thing. Violence by the KKK, murdering Freedom Summer workers, right? And so there's a lot of movement towards civil rights and equality. But by 1966, there are some race riots in northern cities, and this really kind of helped to end and reduce support for civil rights among whites. And we start to see the civil rights movement transition into things like Black Power and that sort of thing. Okay, so that kind of summarizes what the civil rights movement was like from about the mid-50s to about the mid-60s.